Pressing. The next item is number 12, an application for a certificate of appropriateness in the Borough of Manhattan, docket number 14-2203, Block 97, Lot 144, 138 Beekman Street in the South Street, Seaport Historic District. A building designed by Richard Cook and Associates. I'm sorry, that's not it. I'm sorry. It's docket number 15-7767, Block 13, Lot 27, 25 Broadway, the Kennard Building, an individual and interior landmark. A neo-Renaissance style building designed by Benjamin Wister Morris and built in 1917 to 19. The application is to modify an entrance, replace windows and a door, and install plaques and louvers at the exterior, and to remove counters, construct partitions, and install doors, louvers, signs, and fixtures at the designated interior.
The application is for exterior and interior alterations related to the adaptive reuse of the Great Hall, which is an interior landmark at the Kennard Building, also an individual landmark at 25 Broadway, located on the west side of Broadway, bounded on the north by Morris Street, on the west by Greenwich, and on the east by Broadway. There are several components of this application. The exterior component of the application includes the installation of signage and the reinstallation of a railing on the Broadway facade, the installation of louvers at the window openings on Morris and Greenwich Street, and modification of an entrance at Greenwich Street. The interior component of the application includes replacing modern infill, removing the historic travertine counters, and installing louvers, carpeting, emergency lighting, and signs, as well as temporary movable trusses. The portion of this proposal that relating to the removal of the historic travertine counters was presented to the Commission in April of this year. At that time, the Commission requested to see the entire proposal related to the adaptive reuse of the space, and the applicant is here to discuss the details of the proposal.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Misha Hunter, Lee Saltzman Architects. I'm with the team from Cipriani as well as Brooke Shaffrin from Capolino and Company, and also the architect, Kevin Williams.
Kevin Brown.
Kevin Brown, sorry about that. So just in case there are any questions, in the interest of time, I'm going to try to move as speedily as I can.
Please do.
If you can think that on Thursday evening at Community Board 1, I was able to achieve 17 minutes with Community Board questions for the entire
Great.
presentation. So
Let's do better.
I'm going to try to meet it or top it. So here we go. First, just to be all on the same page, the designation of the Cunard Building and the interior and exterior landmarks. So just going the presentation. Let's see how we go. Here we go. So the exterior and interior work, as described, consists of work on the Broadway facade. Let me just see if I can get this thing working. Here we go. Broadway, Morris Street, and Greenwich Street, as well as interior alterations within the designated space. Just so that we're all clear, because I don't have time to repeat myself. The non-designated area is hatched. The designated space inside is without hatching. So we'll move forward as quickly as we can. Let's see here. There we go. Broadway, the historic view on the left, the existing view on the right. The components of the work on Broadway consist of installing 2 new signs at the rusticated masonry here, reinstalling a ramp railing, ADA railing at an existing ramp that was temporarily removed for off-site maintenance and repair, and then be reinstalled in the existing sleeves, and then installing a new flag at an existing pole. Here's the proposed, so 2 new signs, and then will actually be mounted at locations where there previously were signs, so using the same anchorage points. And then also for the flag, that will match the size of the American flag already on the southmost pole. And here's the elevation railing. Here is a detailed view, so you can see there actually were infill at the areas of the previously existing signs. The proposed signs will only cover the exterior faces of the rusticated masonry, will not cover any masonry joints. Here's some details of the proposed signs. More in terms of section and the anchorage points. The bronze with raised lettering with a green background. That's part of the Cipriani standard color, and with a epoxy stainless steel anchorage. The flag, in terms of dimensions, is scaled to the existing pole and will match the size of the American flag, as I mentioned, at the southmost pole. Here is the existing ramp. This is at the northmost bay on Broadway, and so the railing was removed off-site for some maintenance and repair, and the landlord intends to reinstall it using the existing sleeves. Moving to the Morris Street elevation, you can see an overall existing view, just so that we're all aware, the sign here belongs to a school that has nothing to do with the Cipriani space. We're talking about this window here, and this window here, as well as these two basement windows. So typical conditions and an existing louver that you can see here in that oblique view. The existing overall elevation, the proposed, here's the detail. So glazing only would be removed while retaining the muntins at these windows here and here, removing this non-historic 1/1 window here, removing plywood panels and other infill from behind existing grills at the basement level. And then the proposed, installing new louvers at these locations here and here with a finish to match the adjacent multi-light windows. And then here, installing a new louver, matching the louver here immediately to the east, installing new louvers at the basement level behind the existing grills. The finish of these louvers will match the adjacent louvers immediately to the west. And these are required by code in terms of egress, intake, and outtake for the mechanical equipment inside of the proposed space. Here is the historic view from 1995 of the Greenwich Street elevation. This is a detailed view. The proposal includes removing this non-historic hollow metal door and infill, and this window here, which consists of a fixed transom and a hopper window. Here's an overall elevation. Here's the proposed. I'll show you again in detail. Here's the removal here and here, and the proposed. A new door that will match the configuration, finish, and appearance of these doors located immediately to the south, with a metal transom panel, again, that will match the condition immediately to the south. And then the proposed louver at the second floor that will match the louver condition and finish of what is presently existing on Morris Street elevation. And I forgot to mention that there is a historic granite sill at the door. That granite sill will be salvaged and lowered into the sill of the proposed door. So there will be an at-grade access. Moving to the interior, the plan on the left represents the interior designated space, entering from Broadway with vestibule entrances and the vestibule proper, with the passageway and then the Great Hall space. This is a historic view from 1920 of the Great Hall space. You can see the historic counters, which no longer exist inside. Moving to the interior work scope, all of the scope is itemized and numbered corresponding to the numbers here. We're going to break it down thematically as we move through the space. So first, passageway door and infill, counter, floor, carpet, attendant grills, and infill. So passageway door at the southmost portion of the passageway, that door and infill are proposed to be replaced. The counters at the Great Hall to be removed. The terms of the historic elevation of the south passageway, we found this historic elevation, which reflects grille-type doors with an enframement, masonry surround, with a masonry rondelle enframed above. At some time in the past, that passageway location was in fact moved slightly to the north. So it used to terminate here, and presently it terminates here. The wall terminates here. This is the existing condition photograph, which has metal grille type doors and then gypsum plywood infill above it. This is a existing condition view looking south, so the doors I was just speaking about are located here that will be seen in context with these grilles as well in the vestibule and this vestibule enframement. In terms of existing elevation, we have the elevation and plan here. This is the historic elevation based on the historic drawing that we have uncovered. And then the proposed. These doors will be wider in order to be code compliant, but will match the detail and finish of the historic doors and grilles that are located in the vestibule. There will be also a proposed exit sign directly above the doors, and salvaged or new travertine from the counter, if possible, to be salvaged and reused, and if not, new travertine, matching the articulation from the historic elevation. Moving on to the counter floor and carpet, we see from this historic plan where the counters historically were in terms of their footprint within the space, very much complementing the interior space. And then also in terms of the rotunda and the dome, so I'll call that out in a moment. Here are some photographs from the post office, so we can see, unfortunately, that there were some uncomplimentary alterations that occurred to the counter. The historic counters were removed, and a singular counter that bisects the space was installed. We can see that bisecting counter here, and so from the view looking to the west and then looking to the east. So this is the existing condition. And unfortunately, the area of the floor behind the counter was severely compromised with a cement wash that was applied over top of the historic marble and travertine floor. There are some localized areas of the historic floor that are exposed, but for the most part, the floor is very compromised. The proposal is to remove the counter, and then underneath the counter there is a 6-inch depression. The 6-inch depression would be proposed to be infilled with new concrete. And then at the point of interstice between the new concrete infill and the historic floor, there would be a proposal to bevel the floor so that when the proposed carpet is installed over the concrete fill, where the carpet meets the historic floor, there would not be a trip hazard. So I'll show you that in a moment. This is a typical condition of the historic floor consisting of travertine with bands of marble and marble mosaic inlay. This represents an area of historic floor that was not compromised by the post office. These are some detailed photographs, again, of the compromised floor with some very localized areas of exposed historic floor, but very, very compromised overall. This plan indicates the distinction between the area of the compromised floor behind the counter and then the historic intact floor beyond. The proposal calls for a new carpet to be installed over the compromised floor areas only, and allowing for the historic floor that is not compromised but is intact to remain exposed. The proposed color scheme for the carpet consists of a field color that attempts to recall the color of the historic travertine, and then a border condition. So that is the proposal for the carpet. We have samples here available for your review. Excuse me. Moving on, so just so that we're orienting ourselves, Broadway is over here. I was just speaking about the south passageway and the door here. And then now we're going to speak about the rotunda, so we're moving progressively to the west. Just to have a little bit more detail in have this elevation from the south, elevation looking at the rotunda. So we see the historic travertine columns, and then in the historic elevation there were in fact grills. We do not have the historic detail of those grills, but we do at least have this elevation. The plan indicates that the wall space in between the columns existed at some of the columns, but not all, at the south end, and there were no walls between the travertine columns at the north end. Also note that in the area between the masonry piers, in the domes, there were no walls. So that is not the current condition, but I will show you that in a moment. The existing condition of the south wall in the rotunda, this consists of plywood infill, painted to look like travertine, with non-historic grills in the upper register, with the historic travertine columns in between. At the north end of the rotunda, historic travertine columns with painted plywood infill. The proposal, as I mentioned, includes mechanical upgrades, and so we looked for and found a precedent of a bronze decorative grill, radiator grill in the passageway that would be used as the precedent for the proposed radiator grills in the rotunda. So you can see the existing north and south elevations respectively. The proposal calls for new infill that would consist of a gypsum plywood backup with a stucco that would be scored to recall travertine, and then a faux painted finish on top of that scored stucco. We have a sample here. And then a decorative grill, again, using that precedent from the passageway, and this would be installed in the upper register in between the historic travertine columns with the design and finish to match the historic grill. We have it in section, the existing and the proposed. In terms of the domes, the four domes here, here, and here, we have the existing condition, which consists of travertine enfrainment at dome number 1 with plywood infill and hollow metal doors. We also see a condition of an air diffuser in the soffit above the entrance. And then here for view of dome 3, which is typical for 2, 3, and 4, again, plywood infill, non-historic louvers, and hollow metal doors. These are all proposed to be removed. Just in terms of existing elevation, plan, and section of dome number 1. The proposal calls for exposing more of the historic travertine at the return, and exposing also the travertine sill in its entirety, and then using either salvaged or new travertine at the cut for the linear diffuser that would be removed. So there would be new travertine installed in the soffit to match the adjacent travertine. And the elevation that you're seeing is beyond, so we can see it in the section here for the proposed new grill, again, using the same design and finish of the grill that we can use in the rotunda, and then new passageways beyond that point. This would be in a non-designated space. Here is the existing condition for domes 2, 3, and 4. Again, the view of the existing, the elevation of the existing, all to be removed. The proposed consists of new wood panel doors. Again, these would be leading to service spaces. So we wanted to find something that was utilitarian, but also something that would complement the space. And again, with a louver above in the upper portion of the register, and then this plywood with a stucco with faux painted finish above the doors. In terms of life safety upgrades, the proposal calls for both smoke detectors installed above the line of the cornice in the perimeter of the Great Hall, as well as emergency exit signs that would be installed in the vestibule, passageway, and at the westmost wall of the Great Hall. This view gives us a view of the existing condition of the door at the northmost bay within the vestibule. So we have grill doors, and then a grill at the location of the transom area, and then travertine above. This is one of the typical of 3 vestibule enclosures for lawns. The elevation, as I was just speaking about, corresponding with the photograph, the proposed exit sign will be mounted with clamps to the historic grill so as not to penetrate any historic material, and a conduit will be fed behind so as not to be visible, again, concealed conduit, and with minimal or no damage to the historic fabric. At the vestibule enclosures, there are 2 doors per enclosure, so there will be 2 proposed signs, 6 in total, and these already have electrification, so the plan would be to feed conduit behind the 2 proposed exit signs that would be face mounted or surface mounted above the door's center line, and hopefully with this minimal attachment method for the exit signs as possible, and to maintain as much of the historic fabric as possible. In the west wall of the Great Hall, you can see that there is a cast iron and glass wall here, and in the bottom of that particular wall, there's actually a small opening. The proposal calls for installing a new exit sign above that entrance, clamped and mounted in a manner that would not damage the historic fabric, and then also with a conduit feed behind that would not be visible from the designated space. Just as an existing condition of the illumination that presently exists above the line of the cornice, the proposal calls for smoke detectors that involve a laser beam connection. These would be installed with also concealed conduit above the line of the cornice that would not be visible from any public thoroughfare.
No sprinklers.
No sprinklers. There's been a determination from the Department of Buildings that the sprinklers are not required. This is a catalog cut of the proposed exit sign. And then in terms of temporary installations, movable trusses are proposed that would be very event specific. These are not a configuration that reflects what would be installed for each event, but just showing proposed typical installations of trusses that would not be permanently attached in any way to the historic floor. The historic wall would be moved in and out in a manner that would be stored in non-designated space. And this is a typical installation. You can see how the truss has been designed to expose as much of the historic fabric as possible and be complementary to the space. This would be for AV and lighting and sound installations, again, on an event-by-event basis. And there you go.
Okay, great, Misha. Questions, folks? Oh, you can any questions on all of that? It's comprehensively presented and with great, yes.
About the stucco at the beginning, the stucco will remind you or look like or something. What material?
Sure. This is an example of travertine, and then the actual stucco. This is a mock-up of this stucco that's been scored, troweled, and then faux painted. So you can see.
Can we do something else?
So you can see that the contractor, I think, really did an excellent job in matching.
And so where does that go? Everywhere that you?
That will go in the areas of the north wall and the south wall of the rotunda. So those 2 areas replacing plywood. And then at the areas of domes 2, 3, and 4, where there is a proposal to remove the existing plywood and hollow metal doors and louvers and install this. At the area of the passageway, the proposal is to remove that gypsum plywood, but install either salvaged or new travertine.
But you are installing travertine in some other area?
Yes, and again, the plan would be to salvage from that counter if at all possible. But again, that really depends on the contractor being able to accomplish that.
Yes. Oh, then Michael.
So these trusses are for mounting of lighting and I guess speaker systems, right? So where is the location for the controls of all that stuff?
That's a good question.
I can answer that. It would
Up in the
be-
front, please identify yourself by name.
Thank you. My name is Clifton Clark. I work for Cipriani. It's a
Okay.
pleasure to be here today. The sound control and lighting control will be on rollable platforms to have as little impact on the facility as possible, and then also to allow the designers and the different party planners to set up to come in, see the room, have their vision, and then have everything move around for, to facilitate the party and then to be as invisible as possible.
And just to be clear, there is no plan for a DJ booth at all.
Correct.
No
That's-
DJ
that's-
booth.
That's passe, that's
The
yesterday.
DJ has this.
Form.
Zero DJ
Yes.
booth. That's right, in your pocket DJ booth.
Right, right.
So,
Victim of the
But the-
Another obsolete occupation.
But the carts and so on will be stored in one of these outside areas?
Designated space,
Yeah.
and in fact, on your plan, I
Yeah,
will show
that's
you
true. Except the real DJ.
here. My understanding is that the spaces, non-designated spaces would be the host sites for the storage of the temporary
Okay.
trusses, and they would be moved on some kind of casters to their proposed locations and then moved out when they're not
And
used.
ditto for the trusses. You won't always need all of those trusses. They'll be removed when they're not
Correct.
used.
Correct.
Correct.
Okay.
Michael, do you have a question?
I'm just curious if the ceilings are a significant part of this space, and I'm curious to know if you're addressing any of the deterioration of the ceilings, which is not insignificant.
Indeed. I have spoken with Cipriani on this matter, and my understanding is that they've engaged a structural engineer to do a conditions assessment of the structural steel above the ceiling at this time, because there are areas of water damage. The first stage, my understanding is that they'll do the conditions assessment and then follow the recommendations of the structural engineer to ensure that there are no life safety issues. And then they have also engaged a consultant for the paint finishes. But the first stage really is to look at the structural engineering and make sure that there's no life safety issue.
Okay. Anybody else?
Oh, and I forgot, if I may,
Yeah.
forgot to mention that the areas of the 4 domes, the ceilings of the 4 domes will be restored as part of this proposal. So that's another, sorry, I forgot, yes, sorry.
Staff?
The grills,
The ceilings?
The 4 domes, so I can show you here.
So staff is working with the approach to the ceilings?
Yeah. So
Yeah.
these dome ceilings here,
Yeah.
those will be restored, yes.
Roberta, it's your.
Yes, the grills, the ones that are at the bottom are for the mechanical.
Yes.
Right. And so at the top, where you're taking them out of it when you're making grills and the areas and the windows, what is that? Or is that area, what is that for?
It's all for the mechanical upgrades for the adaptive use of the space. Presently, they don't have the air conditioning needs that they will require in order for this to be a public event space. So in order to properly condition air, they need to add a certain number of levers. The mechanical equipment, of course, will be in the non-designated area.
One last. The
Sure.
carpet, so you showed the carpet
Yes.
as a rectangular shape. And
Yes.
so how does that fit into this
Sure, let me just show you.
area?
Sure. So the historic floor, as you can see, exists very much in about a third of the Great Hall space intact and will remain exposed. It is also existing in the passageway in the vestibule. The area behind the counter was modified by the post office, unfortunately. And so the area behind the counter had an application of some sort of concrete wash there cannot remove that without causing damage to the historic floor underneath it because of the bonding action of the cured concrete wash to the historic floor. So the proposal is to install new carpet with this sort of beige color for the field to recall the travertine, and then to have border conditions that again try to recall the historic border of the floor.
Okay,
Does that answer your question?
Well, you showed something very rectangular, so.
Yes, okay, this was just to try to give you an idea of the field and then a typical border, but it's not
So
matching.
it is shaped like
Yes.
each of the floor areas?
Yes, what is shown on this plan is actually the way that the carpet will appear. But we just wanted to give a rendering to show the typical field condition and the typical border condition, so you get an idea. And again, we have samples here available if you'd like to look at them.
Okay. Okay, I don't think we need the samples right now, but we'll go to testimony with Barbara Zay.
Barbara Zay of the Historic Districts Council. HDC appreciates the opportunity to comment on specific aspects of both the exterior and interior changes being proposed in this application for work on the Cunard building. On the exterior, HDC wonders whether the proposed louvers should match the existing bronze windows into which they will be installed, rather than matching the existing black louvers elsewhere on the facades. On the interior, HDC finds the installation of a carpet on the floor to be acceptable and generally approves of the design at the center, but asks that an effort be made to use a carpet border that more closely resembles the border found on the original floor. Also on the interior, HDC asks that new grills be fabricated to replicate existing ones and that historic metalwork not be interrupted by exit and emergency signage. In particular, on the entrance vestibule's north wall, we ask that this signage be placed on the flat surface above the metalwork rather than embedded directly into it. Given that 25 Broadway is one of the city's great and rare interior landmarks, HDC would like to express its dismay at the Great Hall's closure since its days as a post office, which moved out nearly 10 years ago. At this time of transition, the opportunity presents itself to turn that tide by opening up the space to the public once more. Cipriani's use of the Great Hall would make the space visible only to guests at private functions, a practice that the organization has been criticized for at other iconic venues, such as the Rainbow Room, 55 Wall Street, and the former Bowery Savings Bank on 42nd Street. At the very least, HDC would like to see the vestibule used as an alternate entrance for the building's other tenants and for the public, affording views of the Great Hall to countless numbers of people, not just those invited and paying to experience it. The privatization of interior landmarks is an unfortunate trend. In his 2006 New York Times article, So You Think You Can See a Landmark, David Dunlap bemoaned the inaccessibility of 14 interior landmarks in Lower Manhattan, including the Cunard building. Where and when possible, these treasures should be opened up to adhere to the definition of interior landmarks as being, quote, customarily open or accessible to the public. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Community Board recommends approval, as you had alluded, and I'll just read one of their whereas clauses, that the committee commended the applicant on a very thoughtful and thorough presentation, and then generally totally approved it unanimously. So, good. Respond to what's been said, if you wish.
I would be happy to.
Yeah.
The first is that the Cipriani organization, I think, is trying very hard to be good stewards of the building, and they have mentioned to me that in terms of public access, the plan would be to allow for public tours.
Good.
Similarly to what they do at 55 Wall Street, and that those public tours would be allowed into the passageway, the vestibule, and again, depending on the availability of staff to coordinate with that. But given the fact that this has been closed for 20 years, the goal is to at least have it to be open, and I think a tremendous effort has been made in that issue.
Okay. That's it? Okay, thank you very much. Discussion, Fred, please.
For me, the moral of this tale is never let the U.S. Post Office into your historic, to call Cipriani instead. And I'm really delighted by the testimony, but also the rebuttal about the nature of opening up the space for more than just private use and viewing. I think that's important and laudable. Let me say that I know this space very well, having once before I sat on this table, brought an applicant, and to test the waters, the chairman, the council, and head of preservation came to the site, and as I described what I wanted to do for this client, the sad, stern faces who looked at me convinced me that we should retreat quickly to find another space, which we did. Nonetheless, this is, as we all know, an extraordinary place, and it's really sad that it's been closed to the public for so long. I mean, it's really an astounding place. To me, I've spent more time now telling you about all these anecdotes than I will having any issue with any part of what you want to do. I think this is a very, very sensitive, careful, adaptive reuse, I guess you would have to call it, of course, but nonetheless, you're greatly experienced at working in these great spaces and know how reversibility works and how working very carefully with the existing structure also works. So I really have no real specific thing to say. I think it's critical that you continue to work with staff. There are all sorts of little issues that will come up that will require staff work. The one thing that I did notice, I mean, all this Samuel Yellen ironwork is extraordinary too, and putting exit signs on it, I think, strikes a bad note. I'm sure you can work with staff to figure out how things like that, and there'll probably be others, can be worked out. Great job, though.
Good. Michael?
I also have a moderate amount of experience with this place. I did a condition assessment of it when the then new owner was considering having a museum of sports lease the interior.
That's his.
We retreated.
What we did find was actually that cementitious coating came off the floor relatively easily. We did a test. However, don't write that down. What I would hope is that any adhesive applied to the floor in order to install the carpet be readily reversible, because someday you will be able to redo that floor. And I also want to repeat what Fred said. Every negative thing having to do with the interior of that building was a result of the U.S. Postal Service. They can come and get me if they wish, but I approve everything that you're proposing.
What happened to the post office since the 30s when they built so beautifully?
I agree. First of all, I want to thank the applicant. The last time they were here, we had asked for a comprehensive approach to the building, and oh boy, did they give us one. And I think that's great, and thank you very much. The detail and thoroughness with which this application has been presented is really fantastic, and I think that if the restoration of the space equals this level of detail, we'll all be very lucky as New Yorkers to be part of this resurrected space. A few tiny little comments. Number one, I think the grills in the rotunda, north and south walls, should, as more closely as possible, emulate that which was found in the research, where the grills go all the way across instead of just being little dots. And this can all be done with staff, of course. And I think you want to look at, if you're going to have the exit signs in front of grill work or other decorative material, having them to be see-through, as is shown in the cut, seems like it's going to be weird. I don't think it'll work, and I would just look at the exit sign program a little bit. These trusses will probably not come down very much. In my experience with these kind of spaces, they're usually left in place, all or most of them, because they're used for almost every party. But I think that the way that they've been approached here is sensitive and is reasonable, and if they work with staff to ensure that the details of it are worked through carefully, I think it can be appropriate. That was my biggest concern about how that was going to be handled, and I think that it's been handled nicely. I would urge the applicant to consider, if Michael is correct that the cement wash came off, to explore trying to restore maybe parts of the border areas But I wouldn't withhold my approval if that is not done. I would just encourage it. I think it'd be fantastic.
Okay.
Yeah, the transformation and restoration is just absolutely blessed. It's just phenomenal that between 1 Broadway and 25 Broadway, it's just loaded with history, and it's just marvelous that it's the architecture that's there.
Yeah, I also want to thank the applicant for coming back with like a very comprehensive presentation, very clear, very easy to follow in the book, even though it's like a very fat book. And I think the proposal is really excellent. I agree that the trusses probably won't move so much, but the nature of them being so open and really standing separate from the structure and not hanging from the ceiling as we've seen in other places, which do violence to the ceiling, is really, I think, a great solution. It really reads more like furniture than it does like built in. And I only have 2 tiny comments. One is, I'm not quite understanding the carpet transition. There's a section that was next to the counter that remains as original material, and then the carpet begins in sort of a funny way of following it and ending in a strange way. So I'm wondering whether the carpet transition might work with, say, Michael's suggestion about trying to see if there's some of that cementitious material that can be removed, and you sort of work the removal into the transition so it becomes clear to a visitor that that's actually what's going on, is sort of the degradation of the restoration into carpet as a transition. I'm not totally convinced that the pattern of the carpet is the right way to go either, because the detailing of the mosaics is very delicate, and these are giant rosettes and so on. And then just one other comment about the finish of the exterior grills. This is working with staff because I don't really know the answer, but I think they should look at the grills being brass finish as well.
Well, I think this is an excellent presentation, and I'm very pleased to see this renovation and adaptive reuse going forward. And I think for the most part, it's really excellent. And I agree that, on some minor details, the staff can work with the applicant, but I do think that it is very much approvable.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with that. I also think that the grills, because they're so prominent, and now they in terms of placement, they look, I think, better than what they were before. That they maybe should consider having them in bronze instead of the wrought iron black. And I think that the other suggestion that was made in testimony about even exploring having the carpet reflect the pattern of the floor beneath is also something good. I really couldn't tell what the carpet would look like in that area. So
Yeah.
although it was a very detailed presentation, except for that, I think that for staff, they should actually show what that carpet really looks like and how thick the bands are and how they work.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, want to add something, Michael?
Yeah, if I might, to
Yeah, sure.
Marjorie's point, part of the problem here is when they started moving all these desk areas around, and again, a lot of that's the post office, they chopped a lot of that original floor up. And so a floor restoration in there would probably cost upwards of $2.5 million, which I'm sure would just kill any project there. And so in my estimation, the approach they're taking with the floor now is the appropriate one at this point.
Okay. Great job, very appropriate. Good. Cipriani's got a good track record, and this is an indication of more to come, so I greatly appreciate it. And close the hearing now with a motion and a second. Michael Devonshire, if you could power through this one. This one, take a deep breath and...
Anyone want to go for coffee first? In the matter of 25 Broadway, the Kennard Building, an individual interior landmark, an application to modify the entrance, replace windows and door, install plaques and louvers in the exterior, remove counters, construct partitions, install doors, louvered signs, and fixtures at the designated interior. I recommend approval, finding That the proposed alterations will support the adaptive reuse of the Great Hall without eliminating, concealing, or diminishing any of the significant architectural features of the exterior or designated interior. That the proposed plaques, railing, louver, and entrance to the exterior facades will be modest installations which will remain secondary to the significant features of the facades. That the signage, plaques, and railing at the Broadway entrances and existing ramp will reuse existing penetrations from previous signage and railings installations. The plaques and railing will be well-scaled to the building and simply designed and utilize materials and finishes that are compatible with the historic materials and finish palettes of the building. That all of the proposed exterior louvers will be simply designed, finished to blend with the fenestration and pattern and installed within existing masonry openings. Whoa. That the louvers at the casement windows will be installed by removing the glazing and installing the louver within the sashes, thereby helping maintain the historic metalwork and configuration of the windows. That except for the louvers and casement windows, all proposed louvers will replace modern infill and be installed in locations which will not draw undue attention to the installations. That lowering the stone sill and replacing modern entrance infill with simply designed metal and glass infill at the Greenwich Street facade will help provide barrier-free access without eliminating any historic fabric or drawing undue attention to the secondary entrance. That the removal of the altered teller counters and installation of replacement partitions, doors, louvers, carpeting, exit signs, and trusses at the designated interior will help address functional and safety requirements for new use while maintaining primacy of the historic fabric. That although the existing stone teller counter at the center of the designated interior includes components of the historic counters, the historic components are no longer in their original locations at the sides of the rooms, or only a small portion of the original counters that have been highly altered as part of their reassembly into the new counter. Therefore, the removal of this counter will not eliminate intact significant architectural feature or detract from the composition of the designated interior. That the historic masonry from the counter will be salvaged and reused within the designated interior to the extent possible. That the proposed carpeting will only be installed over highly altered portions of the historic stone flooring and modern flooring and will feature a design which will be compatible with the decorative pattern of the remaining adjoining historic flooring. That the proposed replacement of the existing modern partitions will not remove any historic fabric or significant architectural features. That although several of the replacement partitions will be installed within locations which historically were open, these locations currently serve as boundaries between the designated interiors and repurposed portions of the building that are outside of the designated interior. That the replacement partition at the southern end of the shortened passageway will replicate the historic design of the original end of the passageway. That the replacement partitions at the sides and corners of the Great Hall will be simply designed and finished to blend with their surrounding context, helping them remain harmonious subordinate elements. That the proposed louvers at the new partitions at the sides of the Great Hall will replicate the replacement and size of louvers which were historically present at one side of the room and will feature grills with designs derived from historic grills within the hall. That the paired doors and louvers at the corners of the room will be well scaled to their locations and utilize materials, finish, and details which will be in keeping with the aspects of the room and a simple design which will be compatible with those relatively secluded sections of the room. That although the exit signage will be installed in historic metalwork, it will be placed in plain fascia of the bronze door entrance infill with minimum amount of penetrations to the historic metalwork in a typical location which complies with safety regulations. That the trusses will be movable installations which will not be anchored to any portion of the interior and therefore will not damage or permanently conceal any historic fabric and will remain readily reversible. And the cumulative effect of the proposed work will support the special architectural and historic character of this individual landmark and its designated interior and its adaptive reuse.
Second, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Approved? Anything further you want to add, Michael? Done, thank you.